Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of 3 John. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety and Jay Rivenbark, and we're going to look at a question from 3 John. But since it's Monday, let's look at the theme. So the theme of 3 John is Christian hospitality. It's this really short letter written by the Apostle John to encourage them to. He's specifically talking about a particular kind of person that they should be hospitable to. But I think hospitality is something Christians should be prone to anyway. And he defines hospitality as showing love and kindness to fellow believers, particularly those who travel and preach the gospel, even if they're strangers. And so he commends this one person for their hospitality. He criticizes another for their lack of hospitality and their desire to keep others from showing the hospitality. And he also provides some instruction on how believers can demonstrate hospitality by imitating the good example of some and avoiding that of others. So our reading today was verses 5 through 8 of 3 John, and then Romans 12, verses 10 through 21. And he says, "Dear friend, you are being faithful to God when you care for the traveling teachers who pass through, even though they were strangers to you. They have told the church here of your loving friendship. Please continue providing for such teachers in a manner that pleases God. For they are traveling for the Lord, and they accept nothing from people who are not believers, so we ourselves should support them, so that we can be their partners as they teach the truth." When I read this, in my mind, what I picture is what I grew up with as evangelists, itinerant evangelists who didn't have a church they pastored at, but they moved from place to place. But in this case, that very well be a misguided perception, because most likely these are teachers who would come and stay for a significant period of time to help teach them the basics of the Christian faith. They may even be there to plant churches, but it's not likely they were there just as a revivalist. It was weird. We called them evangelists, but they were really revivalists. Maybe people got saved, but it was more for the church. We called them revivals, because we wanted the people revived. But the question becomes, and you can find this in a couple of places where it talks about this: why do we pay teachers or preachers of the gospel? Couldn't it all be done by volunteers? So why do we pay them? Why can't we just depend on volunteers?
Well, as in this case here, he denotes multiple places that these, quote, traveling teachers, that's what they did. That's all they did. They were not engaged in other occupations or businesses. They literally were giving their lives to the gospel and teaching truth, whether they were there for a month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever. And then apparently they would move on to another location. But he makes it clear in here that that's what they did full time. And they had specific callings and specific giftings that not everybody has.
We have all seen, and there's still lots of situations that exist, where people who do have a quote unquote church job, or even pastors that are working another full-time job. And the thing I feel that I see most often is churches that aren't satisfied with the amount of time and attention that they're getting from that pastor, but as a result, it's nearly impossible for them to give what they probably would like to give to that job, because their attention and time is so divided. And I also think that, on an even more practical level, there's a really big difference, for lack of a better term, between somebody who knows they have something else to fall back on, or putting all your eggs in one basket, because then you can be fully committed to what it is that you've been called to do in that job.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. As somebody who my entire ministry has, I've never had to work a job. that's not what I would call it, but I have owned a business, that took my time and energy. And sometimes it took too much of my time and too much of my energy, and we find Paul was a missionary. We would have called him a missionary. And maybe that's a better word here is a missionary. But he, in places, supported himself. Now, we don't know that he did that everywhere. In a particular place, and it suddenly is escaping me which church he writes that to, but he tells them, you didn't give me anything. I supported myself. And there is some value in that because you're not as beholden to people, because that's one of the flaws of the church is often money controls power and everything's done through a few people who are able to give the most. And that's bad as well. Finding that balance is a very important thing. And sometimes you want to make sure your motives are not about the money, but there is something to say about people who sell out. Like that's the way I would say it. So my dad would be a good example of that, and maybe some of my I'm trying to decide whether I want to share this or not because, like, it was really personal when I did it. Recently, I was at a conference for something our church is doing. They called it a retreat, and for the most part, I expected something different than what I saw originally. At least at that piece. But there were a couple of spiritual exercises that they asked us to do. And he taught a lesson on lies that we believe. And how lies can affect who we believe we are and our identity, things that get in our mind. And he talked about foundational lies. He used a different word, and I could go look it in my notes, but that's what he talked about. And so part of the exercise is we had to turn to another person that couldn't be our spouse or somebody we work with. So I was there with Barbara and two other people that I knew pretty well, but we had to turn to somebody we didn't know. And we had to talk about a lie that we had believed and how it had affected our life. This is why I was hesitant to kind of go down this path because it took me a while because most of the lesson I didn't resonate with because I'm an optimistic person. I tend to think the best is going to happen. I'm usually looking on the bright side, and if crap happens, let's pick it up and start over tomorrow and we'll be fine. That's typically how I think. And so it took me a while. It took me a while to figure out.
I was going to say, I hope they gave you some time.
They did. No,
it seemed like something you'd be like, oh, that's it.
Yeah, I wasn't quite ready. They gave us some time to think. And I have it I don't have my journal here, but I wrote it in my journal. Like I wrote this out, the whole entire thing. And the one thing, and some of this is a journey that I'm currently on. But the one thing that I could go back to that I think has affected my entire trajectory is my dad, when he graduated college, he graduated with a pulp and paper engineer degree from NC State. And when I was 9 months old, he was working at Weyerhaeuser. So he lived in Washington, but he worked 30 miles from here. As a pulp and paper engineer. And he decided he was going to go be a pastor. And he gave up his career. And it took him about 30 years of ministry before he made pastoring a church what he made as an engineer in the late 60s.
Back then. Yeah.
That's right.
Just to catch up to what was
just
then.
what he was making then. Because the first church he went to, the entire income for the church for the first week was $17. So he had to go get a job, so he taught school. He didn't go back into the field that he could have supported himself with. He went and taught school because in his mind it was temporary.
Mm-hmm.
And we struggled financially. It was tough. I remember as a kid resenting things like wearing tough skin jeans and Bobo tennis shoes,
I know quite well. Yeah.
And kids picking on me, in school. And as I sat there that day, I remembered, I thought through that part of what I have done over my entire life is try to keep that from happening to me. Go to whatever lengths I had to protect myself from being solely dependent on fickle church people. And I hope nobody's offended by what I'm saying. I'm just being very vulnerable. That if they didn't want to support you, they didn't give, because that's what's going on in this story. It's somebody who is jealous or insecure and is like, no, I'm not giving, you don't give. We're going to withhold our tithes. We're going to withhold our money. The pastor don't need to be paid. And it was a tough journey for me just to become a pastor. I resented church people. And, so when I shared with the guy across from me, his name is Chris Fry, I was telling him, I overcompensate for what I look back on now was my dad's complete faith in his call.
Mm.
And I wouldn't have, had they not taught the lesson and made me, because you couldn't pass and say nothing, I wouldn't have thought about it in those terms, but it genuinely is a lie that I told myself. You have got to protect yourself from people who will try to take advantage of you if you're going to be a pastor. And that's what he's talking about right here. We have Gaius, who is being genuine. It doesn't mean they agreed with everything he did or everything he taught or every idea that the leader had. He just said, this is your obligation to do this. And, I have, it's just I think at times, even still today, when I see people pull that, and I maybe somebody's done it here at Open Door, I don't know. I said, I'm taking my money and run. I don't know, and you're going to suffer. I haven't like been up and close and personal with that, but I see it all the time. I saw a pastor recently left his church because the attendance didn't go down. The people just withheld their money. I remember going with my dad. I was just going in the ministry, and this is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about right here. That, and I don't mean to dominate this whole podcast, but
it's relative.
He was an overseer, and he went to this church where they were trying to get rid of the pastor, and this guy stood up in the meeting, and he said, I believe in paying tithes, and he holds up this stack of tithing envelopes, and he said, so every Sunday I've been putting my tithe in an envelope, and I've been putting it in my bedroom drawer, and when a pastor comes that I'll support, I'm going to put all these in the offering plate.
Oh, man. Wow.
Oh, my word.
And, I'm in my...
Should probably go lay that at the altar. And
I'm
ask
in
for
my
forgiveness,
mid-20s,
which you probably do.
and my dad, now, y'all may think I can be harsh, but my dad, it can be he's way more harsh than I am. I do have a little bit of filter. And my dad looked at him and he said, "You're not paying tithes to God. You're paying tithes to yourself. You're laying this at your altar and what you want." He said, "If you give it to God, you have no longer have control over it. And as long as you're putting it in your drawer and you come in here holding it up for these people, because that's what when I think about, that's what that man was trying to do by holding up his tithes. He was trying to influence everybody in that room. Y'all should do the same. And no doubt he had been talking to people and saying you should do the same. And so, this are there preachers who take advantage? The answer to that is yes. There will always be people who take advantage of situations. It doesn't matter what the situation is. There are people on your job who are getting paid more than they're worth. They're showing up late and leaving early and not doing half the work when they're there. But that's just the nature of it. You still have to do the right thing. And so, I don't know. Do y'all have something you want to add to this?
Yeah, the takeaways for me out of this passage where he reminds them, he said that your faithfulness to God is demonstrated when you support those people who are doing the full-time work and service of God. He says, and we become partners with them. There's a much bigger eternal picture attached to that when we give for the right reason, the right motivation, even to support the people who are doing that full-time. He said that you've got buy-in that, and there's eternal rewards associated with it.
Which has nothing to do with your control.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Nothing.
Absolutely.
It has nothing to do with your control. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around 3 John.